So in this video, we'll pick up with commerce. Commerce has to do with the exchange of goods between different parts of the country or different countries. And in this instance, we'll be looking at the commerce or the trade in the South and the North. Most of the time, when you think of the South, you don't think of trade or thriving industries or bustling cities and factories. You think of agriculture and rural society. And although the temper of Southern society discouraged business and commercial activity, considerable manufacturing did develop. There were some small flour mills and lumber mills. There was iron and coal mining, which were pretty popular. And the availability of raw materials and water power in the South led to the development of textile manufacturing. In Rocky Mount, where we live, in the downtown area near Battle Park, there was a cotton mill. So even here in our lovely city, we see that some. However, the Southern textile industry remained pretty insignificant compared with that of the North. And just to throw a statistic at you, less than 15% of all goods manufactured in the U.S. in 1860 came from the South. And so our region pretty much depended on the North for most of its manufactured goods. Northern society, on the other hand, placed a premium on resourcefulness and encouraged experimentation. And industry in that region grew rapidly, especially in the decades right before the Civil War. So the factory system made great strides toward progress, and a shortage of skilled labor led businessmen to begin to use machines instead of trained or skilled laborers. Because you have to keep in mind, most of the cities at this time and most of the factories are filled with immigrants or poor urban workers. Most of them are not skilled craftsmen or skilled laborers. So they began to use machines instead of skilled labor. Industrial growth increased the demand for unskilled labor, and an increase in immigration helped to fill that demand. Skilled artisans still earned good wages at this point, but the influx of machinery in these factories made skills less important, and the wages for an unskilled worker unfortunately could barely support a family. Immigration provided an expanded workforce, and European investors even provided the money necessary for our economic expansion. So European investors pouring into the American economy, and then the savings of millions of Americans and the great hoard of new California gold all added to the supply of American capital or American wealth. And this led to improvements in transportation, it led to population growth, the absence of tariff barriers, and relatively high per capita wealth. And all of that really just provided an expanding market, an ever-expanding market for manufactured goods. So the jobs that were created by this industrial expansion attracted thousands of European immigrants. And like I said, it was immigrants that filled this demand for unskilled labor. So native-born Americans tended to look down on immigrants, many of whom developed prejudices of their own. For example, the Irish often disliked African Americans because they competed with African Americans for work. For instance, one Irish leader, Daniel O'Connell, said that the American Irish were, quote, among the worst enemies of the colored race. And an African American complained back, quote, every hour sees us elbowed out of some employment to make room for some newly arrived immigrant from the Emerald Isle, whose hunger and color entitle him to special favor. So social and racial rivalries really contributed to serious disruptions of economic patterns whenever they appeared. So what was life like for the urban populations? The growth of the urban populations produced slums, which make modern ghettos seem desirable as people lived off about $5 a week. And I typed this into the good old inflation calculator, and this equals about $138 a week in today's time, meaning that people's yearly income would have been a little over $7,000 a year. So because these people were living in extreme poverty, they lived in slums. So wives and children of male factory workers had to also work in the factories to survive and in order to make ends meet. Conditions for skilled workers began to improve a little bit in the 40s and 50s as the working day grew shorter, and most states enacted mechanics lien laws, which ensured that mechanics would be paid for their services after they were finished with working on whatever they were working on. And a Massachusetts court established the legality of labor unions in Commonwealth versus Hunt in 1842. And labor unions just worked together to try to improve working conditions. For the most part, though, unionism was a local thing and it was very weak. At least in part because skilled workers looked down on unskilled workers, and also because few laborers considered themselves part of a permanent working class. And we've said that in a previous chapter that in America, this bourgeoisie mentality of the urban poor masses really didn't develop like it did in Europe. So although the U.S. was a democratic land of opportunity with an expanding economy, few class distinctions, and a comparatively high standard of living, there was still a large class of poor, unskilled, mostly immigrant laborers who were less well off than even most Southern slaves. So the gap between rich and poor began to widen, and society became more stratified. So foreign commerce. What did trade between the U.S. and other nations look like? Well, the U.S. was primarily an exporter of raw materials and an importer of manufactured goods. So that meant we were selling our crop stuff and we were importing finished products. In most years, especially early on, the country imported more than it exported, meaning we bought more than we sold. And cotton was by and large the most valuable export, and textiles was probably the leading import. Great Britain was the leading consumer of American exports and also America's leading supplier. So we were selling and buying mostly from and with Great Britain. Trade was mostly concentrated in large port cities, and some of the smaller ports began to decline in importance. There were some smaller port cities in New England that maintained prosperity because they began concentrating on the whaling industry, which boomed between 1830 and 1860. But increased foreign trade spurred the construction of ships and the development of large, fast clipper ships, which increased trade in these large port cities even more. So methods of transportation. By the late 1840s, steamships captured most of the transatlantic passenger traffic. So they were carrying mail, they were carrying people, carrying goods. Even though fast sailing ships held their own for long voyages, most of the transatlantic passages were made by steamships. Great Britain mastered iron technology, and so that sort of negated the traditional advantages American shipbuilders had enjoyed and gave Great Britain the lead in the development of iron ships, which happened to be stronger, larger, and even less costly to maintain. But at any rate, shipping rates declined, which in turn encouraged more immigration from Europe. Canal building increased greatly between 1830 and 1840. In 1830, there were about 1,200 miles of canals in the United States, and by 1840, there were 3,300 miles of canals. So they more than doubled in that 10-year span. And each year, more Western produce was moving to market through the canals. Another important method of transportation that would take over the world was railroads. And the American railroads were first built in the 1830s. And the first railroads didn't really compete with canals for intersectional traffic. The connections needed to move goods economically over great distances materialized slowly. So at first, most of the trade in the United States was still conducted with or by the canals. Competition among railroad companies prevented connections, and engineering problems also impeded growth. But by 1850, these problems had been solved, and by the end of the decade, the Pennsylvania Railroad was able to cross through the mountains. So financing the railroads. Railroad construction required immense amounts of labor and capital. Immigrants and, in the South, slaves did most of the work. Private investors provided most of the money invested in the railroads before 1860. And then towns and counties and states also pitched in to help fund the railroads, or they invested in railroad stock. And a lot of times towns and states and counties would also grant special privileges to railroads that would include like tax exemptions and the right to condemn property. So Eastern and Southern interests often opposed federal aid to the railroads until after the Civil War. So how did the railroads affect the economy? Well, it opened up a whole new world of possibilities for farmers regarding trade. Railroad construction had profound effects on farming. The location of a railroad helped determine what agricultural land was used and how profitably it could be farmed. And access to world markets through the railroad provided an incentive to agricultural production. So labor remained scarce, but new machines, including the steel plowshare and the McCormick reaper, helped ease the labor shortage. Eastern seaports benefited from the railroads, as did intermediate centers such as Buffalo or Chicago or Cincinnati. But overall, railroads stimulated agricultural economic activity, and they spurred regional concentration of industry and investment banking. And the complexity of railroad operations required elaborate administrative structures, which made them the first modern business enterprise. So the proliferation of railroad lines and competition with the canal system led to a sharp decline in freight and passenger rates, making it affordable to send goods and eventually people by train. So how did the railroad contribute to the sectional crisis? Increased production and cheap transportation through the railroads boosted the Western farmers' income and standard of living. So their days of isolation and independence and self-sufficiency for the family on the frontier pretty much ended, and pioneers even became operators of business and successful farmers. And because the South failed to build a railroad system of its own, it kind of isolated the West from the South. And we've talked about in the last chapter how the West and the South formed an alliance to get cheap Western lands and low tariffs. Well, that alliance began to break down, meaning that when the Civil War came, the West would side mostly with the North instead of the South. So just to kind of wrap things up for this chapter, between the mid-1840s and 1850s, the U.S. experienced remarkable growth in manufacturing, in agricultural production, population, railroad and canal mileage, gold production, and the sales of public land. And such growth inevitably caused dislocations. And there was a serious economic collapse in 1857 that checked agricultural expansion, which hurt the railroads and cut down on demand for manufactured goods. And as a result, unemployment increased. Frightened depositors started runs on banks, which meant that they pulled their money out of a bank and put it in another bank. And when that happens on a wide scale, that can cause a lot of problems. And so most of these banks had to suspend specie payments. And people called this the Panic of 1857. But because the economy was so vigorous during this time, the bad times really didn't last that long, especially in the South. And that was because cotton was booming at the time. And so they were very little affected by the collapse of 1857, again, because cotton prices continued to be high. And this gave some Southern planters the false impression that the South's economy was immune to such violent downturns. And some began to argue that maybe the South would be better off without the Union. So this concludes our Chapter 12 video. And in Chapters 13 and 14, we'll be looking at the Civil War.